June 2026, Seattle, Washington. The heat was suffocating, pressing down upon a stadium of 66,000 souls, each one holding their breath as though the very air itself had grown too heavy to draw in. This was not merely a football match. This was the culmination of a promise made a decade earlier. A promise that football, at last, might belong to America the way it had always belonged to everyone else. But promises in this sport are fragile things, and by the time the floodlights dimmed over Lumen Field that night, this one had already begun to fracture, not on the pitch, not yet, but in the marbled offices of power, thousands of miles away, where a single telephone call would set in motion a chain of events no training ground could ever have prepared a nation for. What happens when the most powerful man in a country decides that a football match requires his personal intervention? And what happens when the institution meant to guard the game against exactly such intrusions finds itself unable, or unwilling, to say no? To understand the weight of what unraveled that evening, one must first understand what came before it. The long, patient decades of a nation waiting to be taken seriously. The United States had spent a lifetime as football's perpetual outsider, respected in fleeting moments, feared occasionally by opponents who underestimated them, but never, not truly, believed in. For generations, American football had been a story told in fragments, flashes of brilliance followed by long, aching silences, cup runs that promised everything and delivered nothing, a public that oscillated between passionate devotion and quiet indifference. In 1994, this same country had hosted the World Cup for the first time. A seed was planted then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, that one day this sport might grow roots here as deep as any other. 32 years passed, and in the summer of 2026, on home soil once more, that seed seemed, for one shimmering moment, ready to finally bloom. Mauricio Pochettino had been entrusted with the impossible. He was asked to take a squad of gifted, occasionally chaotic young men and forge from them something capable of surviving the brutal arithmetic of a World Cup knockout stage. A stage a single mistake, a single lapse in concentration, could undo months of preparation in the space of 90 merciless minutes. And for a time, remarkably, he succeeded. Victory over Paraguay, victory over Australia. And then, most extraordinary of all, a first knockout stage triumph in over 2 decades against Bosnia and Herzegovina, history rewritten in real time, in front of a home crowd that had waited an entire lifetime for permission to believe. They called Christian Pulisic Captain America for good reason. He carried upon his shoulders the accumulated hope of a generation raised on the quiet insistence that their sport did not truly matter, that it never would, that America's football story would forever remain a footnote in someone else's history. And beside him stood Folarin Balogun, young, sharp, dangerous in front of goal, a striker who seemed to embody everything this new, ambitious America believed itself capable of becoming. But legends in this sport are built precisely so they might be tested, and theirs was about to be tested by something no coaching manual, no tactical blueprint could ever have anticipated. It began, as these things so often do, with a single decision, a red card shown without ceremony, without malice, simply the mechanical application of a rule. An automatic suspension followed, the kind of ruling that in any ordinary tournament would have passed unremarked, a footnote forgotten by the following morning. This was not an ordinary tournament, and what followed was anything but an ordinary reaction. Within hours, word began to spread, first as rumor, then as confirmed fact, that the President of the United States had personally telephoned the President of FIFA, requesting, in terms that left little room for polite refusal, that Balogun's suspension be reviewed. Consider for a moment the sheer strangeness of this. A head of state, reaching directly into the machinery of global football, attempting to bend a disciplinary ruling through nothing more than the gravity of his office. Had such a thing ever happened before? Not quite like this, not so publicly, not so brazenly, with the entire footballing world watching in real time as institutional independence was tested against the raw pressure of political power. The president of FIFA now found himself trapped by his own carefully cultivated proximity to power. For years, he had welcomed such closeness as a symbol of the sport's growing reach into the highest corridors of influence. Now that closeness had become a liability. To ignore the request risked insult, to grant it risked the very credibility upon which the sport's fairness depended. The answer, when it finally came, satisfied absolutely no one. The suspension stood, officially untouched, procedurally unchanged, but the damage had already been done, quietly and irreversibly. A perception had calcified in the minds of millions that in this World Cup, on this soil, the rules of the game might, after all, be negotiable, provided one held sufficient power to ask. Belgium arrived in Seattle largely untroubled by the noise surrounding them. 9th in the world rankings, unbeaten in 18 consecutive matches, they had a single, uncomplicated task before them: win the match and move on. And within 9 minutes, they were already achieving precisely that. A calm, unhurried finish found the net. 9 minutes gone. The stadium, so recently deafening with anticipation, fell into a sudden, disbelieving hush, the sound of 66,000 people simultaneously remembering how quickly hope can be punished in this sport. For a moment, redemption seemed within reach. A deflected free kick crept in just past the half-hour mark, and Seattle exhaled, briefly, achingly, as though the story might yet bend back toward the ending they had all traveled so far to witness. But hope, in football, is rarely permitted to linger for long. Within 2 minutes, Belgium struck again. A far-post finish, clinical and unhurried, delivered with the quiet certainty of a team that sensed, perhaps even before it happened, that the outcome had already been decided somewhere beyond the reach of the players on the pitch. And then came the image that would come to define the entire evening. The American manager along the touchline, kicking water bottles across the technical area in fury and disbelief, as the very defense that had carried this team so improbably far began, in full view of a nation, to unravel. A third goal followed shortly after, born not from brilliance but from miscommunication. A moment of costly hesitation at the back, magnified unbearably under the weight of everything riding upon it. It was less a demonstration of opposition quality than a portrait of collapse from within. And then, with cruel timing, the captain himself went down. His tournament, and perhaps his symbolic role as the face of an entire movement, ended not in triumph but in injury of the scoreline. But a brutal one nonetheless, delivered with the quiet efficiency of a team that had never once doubted the outcome, even as the home crowd had dared, briefly, to dream otherwise. The final whistle brought no catharsis, only silence, a silence heavier than any scoreline could ever convey. What remains, in the long aftermath of a collapse such as this, is rarely the number on the board. It is the questions the number leaves scattered in its wake. It's unanswered and unanswerable. Did the telephone call matter? Did the noise surrounding one player's suspension, the accusations, the perception of political interference, the shadow of power draped uninvited across a football pitch, did it seep somehow into the legs and minds of players who had, until that very week, seemed gloriously unburdened by history? Perhaps not directly. Perhaps the defensive fragilities that undid this team that night were always present, quietly waiting for a sufficiently ruthless opponent to expose them. Football, after all, rarely requires a conspiracy to explain a collapse. Sometimes, simple human error is more than enough. But perception in football as in politics carries its own peculiar weight of truth. And the perception that lingered, voiced openly, almost mockingly, by the victors themselves in the hours following the final whistle, was unmistakable. That power had reached for the game, and the game had answered only with silence. They mocked the very notion that a result could be overturned by presidential request, and no one, not even the most powerful man in the nation, could prove them wrong. The manager would leave this tournament, by every statistical measure, as the most successful in his nation's history. Wins recorded, records broken, a country's attention captured as never before, in numbers that would have seemed impossible only a decade earlier. And yet he too would carry forward the quiet, permanent weight of what was left undone, a golden, once-in-a-generation opportunity in front of a home crowd of 66,000 believers, extinguished by mistakes that no political intervention could ever have prevented. The twin free-kick goals scored earlier in the tournament by the young American midfielder, a feat matched by only one other man in the entire 90-year history of this competition, will be remembered in time as a lonely point of brilliance amid the wreckage. A flicker of what might have been possible had the surrounding structure not already begun quietly to fracture. And the president of FIFA, the man who once welcomed a head of state's embrace as evidence of the sport's expanding reach into the highest corridors of global influence, now faces a far more uncomfortable reckoning. When the leader of a host nation believes he may simply request that a ruling be reversed, what does that suggest about the independence of the institution meant to guard the game itself? And if that institution cannot draw a clear line and hold it without hesitation, what confidence can any nation, winner or loser, place in the fairness of the tournament that decides so much? The World Cup will continue, of course, as tournaments always do, marching steadily toward its final gleaming moment beneath lights far removed from the heat and heartbreak of that Seattle evening. But Seattle itself will remain quietly, as a cautionary tale folded into the tournament's larger history, a reminder that football, for all its spectacle, for all its grandeur, has never once permanently bent to the will of those who believed themselves too powerful to lose. In the end, the ball does not answer to presidents, nor to the institutions that govern it, nor to the millions who demand a particular outcome from the safety of their seats. It answers only to the players brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to step forward and strike it. And somewhere in the fading light over that stadium, long after the crowds had gone and the noise had finally settled into memory, a single question lingered. One this story cannot fully answer, but one worth asking nonetheless quietly in the dark. When power reaches for a game it cannot ultimately control, who truly loses more in the end? The team that falls upon the pitch, or the institution that allowed the reaching to happen in the first place? Perhaps there is a third answer, quieter than the other two, and far more haunting. Perhaps it is the game itself that loses something in moments such as these, some small, irreplaceable measure of its innocence, worn away not by the players who compete within its lines, but by those who stand outside them, believing the outcome should belong to whoever shouts the loudest. There is a peculiar cruelty in watching a young nation's footballing dream collapse, not from a lack of talent, nor a lack of heart, but from the accumulated weight of everything swirling around it. The politics, the pressure, the endless scrutiny of a home tournament that promised salvation and delivered, instead, a lesson in humility. The players did not ask for any of it. They simply wanted to play, to compete, to give a watching nation a single night worth remembering for the right reasons. And yet, long after the scoreline fades from memory, long after the next World Cup arrives and this one recedes into history's quieter corners, it will be this particular tension that lingers. The image of a president reaching for a telephone, of a football president unable to decline, of a team collapsing beneath the accumulated noise of it all. A small telling moment in the long unfinished story of a sport that has always, in the end, insisted on writing its own ending, regardless of who might wish otherwise. The lights over Seattle dimmed that night, as they always eventually do. But somewhere in that darkness, the questions remained, patient and unresolved, waiting for the next nation, the next tournament, the next moment when power might once again reach for a game that was never truly built to be controlled.